The twin concepts of freedom of opinion and freedom of association are often intertwined, but it is a mistake to equate them. Association, except in the case of natural groups, is not a fundamental human need but rather a practical convenience. In contrast, absolute, unrestricted freedom of expression for any and all opinions, without any limitations or reservations, is an absolute necessity for the human intellect. As a consequence, it is also a need of the soul, for when the intellect is constrained, the entire soul is disquieted. The nature and limits of the fulfillment of this need are inherent in the very structure of the soul's various faculties. Just as we can indefinitely extend the length of a rectangle without altering its finite width, so too can something be both limited and unlimited. The human intellect can operate in three distinct ways. It can tackle technical problems, seeking the means to achieve a predetermined goal. It can provide illumination during the process of deliberation, aiding the will in selecting a course of action. And finally, it can function independently, divorced from the other faculties, in purely theoretical speculation, temporarily setting aside any practical considerations. In a healthy soul, these three modes of intellectual activity are exercised in turn, each with its own degree of freedom. In its first function, the intellect serves as a servant. In the second function, it becomes destructive and must be silenced the moment it begins to provide arguments in favor of that part of the soul which, in all but the most perfect individuals, always gravitates towards difficulty. But when the intellect operates independently, unencumbered by practical concerns, it must enjoy absolute freedom. Otherwise, the human being is deprived of something essential. A healthy society shares this same need for intellectual freedom. Therefore, it would be desirable to establish a protected realm of absolute freedom within the realm of publication, with the understanding that the works published therein do not in any way represent the views of their authors nor provide any guidance to readers. Within this sanctuary, all arguments, no matter how heinous their cause, could be presented in their full, unadulterated form. It is both right and beneficial that such arguments be exposed. Individuals should be free to extol even that which they most vehemently oppose. It would be widely recognized that the purpose of such works is not to define the author's stance on life's issues, but rather to contribute, through preliminary investigation, to a comprehensive and accurate compilation of the relevant data surrounding each issue. The law would safeguard the publication of these works without exposing their authors to any form of jeopardy. In contrast, publications intended to influence what we call opinion, which in effect means influencing human behavior, constitute acts and must be subject to the same restrictions as all acts. In other words, they must not cause any unwarranted harm to any human being, and above all, they must never contain any explicit or implicit negation of eternal human obligations, once these obligations have been solemnly recognized by law. The distinction between these two realms, the one that lies outside the sphere of action and the one that is part of it, cannot be neatly defined in legal language. Nevertheless, this distinction remains perfectly clear. The separation of these realms is easily established in practice, provided there is a strong will to achieve it. It is evident, for instance, that the entire daily and weekly press falls within the second domain. Journals, too, as they all serve as a source of influence for a particular way of thinking. Only those who renounce this function could claim the right to absolute freedom. The same applies to literature. This would provide a resolution to the recent debate on the subject of morality and literature, which has been clouded by the fact that all talented individuals, out of professional solidarity, have sided with one group, while only fools and cowards have sided with the other. Yet, the position of the fools and cowards was, to a considerable extent, aligned with reason. Writers have an unacceptable habit of wanting to have it both ways. Never more than in our time have they claimed and exercised the role of moral guides. In fact, in the years leading up to the war, no one dared to challenge them except scholars. The place formerly occupied by priests in the country's moral life was now held by physicists and novelists, which is a measure of the value of our progress. But when asked to account for the direction of their influence, writers indignantly took refuge behind the sacred privilege of art for art's sake. André Gide, for instance, was undoubtedly aware of the impact that works like Earthly Foods or The Vatican Cellars had on the practical conduct of life among countless young people, and he took pride in this influence. There is therefore no justification for sheltering such works behind the inviolable barrier of art for art's sake while imprisoning a boy who throws someone off a moving train. We might just as easily invoke the privileges of art for art's sake to excuse crime. The Surrealists, in fact, were not far from doing so in the past. Unfortunately, it is all too true what so many fools have repeatedly asserted about the writer's culpability in our defeat. If a writer, exercising the absolute freedom granted to pure intelligence, publishes works that contradict the moral principles recognized by law, and if he subsequently becomes a public figure of influence, it is reasonable to inquire whether he is prepared to publicly declare that these writings do not represent his stance. Otherwise, it is not difficult to hold him accountable. If he falsifies, it is easy to disgrace him. Furthermore, it must be acknowledged that a writer cannot claim unlimited freedom once he assumes a position of influence in shaping public opinion. A legal definition is again elusive, but the facts are not truly difficult to discern. There is no reason to restrict the law's sovereignty to the realm of things that can be expressed in legal formulas, given that this sovereignty is also exercised through equitable judgments. Moreover, the very need for freedom, so essential to intelligence, demands protection from suggestion, propaganda, and the influence of obsession. These are forms of coercion, a specific kind of coercion that is devoid of fear or physical pain, but is no less violent. Modern technology has provided him with incredibly effective tools. This coercion is inherently collective, and human souls bear its brunt. The state, of course, becomes an agent of repression if it employs propaganda itself, except in the case of a dire necessity for public safety, but it must also prevent its use by others. Advertising, for instance, must be strictly curtailed by law. Its volume must be considerably reduced. It must be explicitly forbidden from ever encroaching upon the realm of pure thought. Similarly, there may be justifiable restrictions on the press, radio broadcasts, and any other similar medium, not only for violations of publicly recognized moral principles, but also for baseness of tone and thought, bad taste, vulgarity, and the promotion of a subtly corrupting moral atmosphere. Such restrictions can be implemented without in any way infringing upon freedom of opinion. For example, a newspaper can be suppressed without its editorial staff losing the right to publish elsewhere, or even, in less serious cases, to remain together to continue the same newspaper under a different name. However, such a suppression would serve as a public branding of infamy, with the risk of recurrence. Freedom of opinion is solely, and with reservations, the right of the individual journalist, not of the newspaper, for only the journalist possesses the capacity to form an opinion. In general, all the issues surrounding freedom of expression become clearer if we establish that this freedom is a fundamental need of the intellect, and that the intellect resides solely in the individual human being considered alone. There is no collective exercise of the intellect. As a consequence, no group can legitimately claim freedom of expression, because no group has the slightest need for it. On the contrary, the protection of freedom of thought requires that groups be legally prohibited from expressing opinions, because when a group begins to hold opinions, it inevitably tends to impose them upon its members. Sooner or later, individuals find themselves prevented, with varying degrees of severity, from expressing opinions that diverge from those of the group, unless they choose to leave the group. Yet, breaking away from a group to which one belongs invariably leads to suffering, at least emotional suffering. And while risk and the possibility of suffering are healthy and necessary elements of action, they are detrimental to the exercise of the intellect. Even a slight fear always causes either weakening or rigidity, depending on the individual's level of courage, and it takes no more than this to distort the extremely delicate and fragile instrument of precision that constitutes the intellect. Even friendship, in this regard, poses a significant danger. The intellect is vanquished as soon as the expression of thoughts is preceded, explicitly or implicitly, by the collective pronoun we, and when the light of the intellect is obscured, after a relatively short period, the love of good goes astray. The immediate practical solution is the abolition of political parties. The party struggle, as it existed under the Third Republic, is intolerable. The single party, which is also its inevitable outcome, is the ultimate degree of evil. The only remaining possibility is a public life without parties. Today, such an idea sounds like something new and daring. All the better, since something new is needed. But in reality, it is simply a return to the tradition of 1789. In the eyes of the people of 1789, there was not even another possibility. A public life such as ours over the past half-century would have appeared to them as a hideous nightmare. They would never have believed it possible that a representative of the people could abdicate their dignity to the point of becoming a disciplined member of a party. Rousseau had already shown clearly clearly that the struggle of parties automatically kills the republic. He had predicted the effects. It would be good to encourage the reading of the social contract at this time. In fact, at present, wherever there were political parties, democracy is dead. Everyone knows that the English parties have traditions, a spirit, and a function that are comparable to nothing else. Everyone also knows that the competing teams of the United States are not political parties. A democracy where public life is constituted by the struggle of political parties is incapable of preventing the formation of a party that has the avowed purpose of destroying it. If it makes laws of exception, it suffocates itself. If it does not make them, it is as safe as a bird in front of a snake. It would be necessary to distinguish two kinds of groupings: the groupings of interests, to which organization and discipline would be authorized to a certain extent, and the groupings of ideas, to which they would be strictly prohibited. In the current situation, it is good to allow people to group together to defend their interests, that is to say, big money and similar things, and to let these groupings act within very narrow limits and under the perpetual supervision of the public authorities. But they should not be allowed to touch on ideas. The groupings where thoughts are stirred up must be less groupings than more or less fluid milieus. When an action is outlined there is no reason why it should be carried out by others than by those who approve it. In the workers' movement, for example, such a distinction would put an end to an inextricable confusion. In the period that preceded the war, three orientations solicited and constantly tugged at all workers. First, the struggle for big money, then the remains, increasingly weak, but always a little alive, of the old syndicalist spirit of yesteryear, idealistic and more or less libertarian. Finally, the political parties. Frequently, during a strike, the workers who suffered and fought would have been quite unable to tell if it was a matter of wages, or a surge of the old syndicalist spirit, or a political operation carried out by a party, and no one else could tell from the outside. Such a situation is impossible. When the war broke out, the unions in France were dead or nearly so, despite the millions of members or because of them. They regained an embryo of life, after a long lethargy, on the occasion of the resistance against the invader. This does not prove that they are viable. It is perfectly clear that they had been killed or almost by two poisons, each of which separately was deadly. Unions cannot live if the workers there are obsessed by money to the same degree as in the factory during piecework. First, because it results in the kind of moral death always caused by obsession with money. Then because, in the present social conditions, the union, being then a constantly acting factor in the economic life of the country, inevitably ends up by being transformed into a single, compulsory, official professional organization. It has then passed into a state of corpse. On the other hand, it is no less clear that the union cannot live alongside political parties. There is an impossibility there that is of the order of mechanical laws. For a similar reason, by the way, the Socialist Party cannot live alongside the Communist Party, because the latter possesses the quality of party, so to speak, to a much higher degree. In fact, the obsession with wages reinforces the influence of the Communists, because the questions of money, however strongly they touch almost all men, also release for all men an ennui so deadly that the apocalyptic perspective of the revolution, according to the communist version, is indispensable to compensate. If the bourgeoisie does not have the same need for apocalypse, it is because high figures have a poetry, a prestige that tempers a little the boredom associated with money, whereas when money is counted in pennies, boredom is in its pure state. In fact, the taste of the bourgeoisie, great and small, for fascism shows that, despite everything, they are bored too. The Vichy government created in France for workers single and compulsory professional organizations. It is regrettable that they gave it, according to modern fashion, the name of corporation, which actually designates something so different and so beautiful. But it is fortunate that these dead organizations are there to assume the dead part of the trade union activity. It would be dangerous to suppress them. It is better to charge them with daily action for big money and immediate demands. As for political parties, if they were all strictly banned in a general climate of freedom, it is to be hoped that their clandestine existence would at least be difficult. In this case, workers' unions, if there is still a spark of true life in them, could gradually become the expression of workers' thought, the organ of workers' honor. According to the tradition of the French labor movement, which has always considered itself responsible for the whole universe, they would be interested in everything that touches on justice, including, if necessary, questions of big money, but from time to time and to save human beings from misery. Of course, they should be able to influence includes professional organizations according to modalities defined by law. There may only be advantages to prohibiting professional organizations from triggering a strike and allowing unions to do so, with reservations, by making risks correspond to this responsibility, prohibiting any coercion, and protecting the continuity of economic life. As for the lockout, there is no reason not to ban it altogether. The authorization of groups of ideas could be subject to two conditions. 1. That excommunication does not exist there. Recruitment would be done freely by way of affinity, without however anyone being invited to adhere to a set of affirmations crystallized in written formulas, but a member once admitted could only be excluded for a breach of honor or the crime of infiltration, a crime which would incidentally imply an illegal organization and consequently expose it to a more serious punishment. There would be a real measure of public safety there, experience having shown that totalitarian states are established by totalitarian parties, and that totalitarian parties are forged by means of exclusions for crimes of opinion. The other condition could be that there is actually a circulation of ideas, and tangible evidence of this circulation in the form of brochures, journals, or typed bulletins in which general problems are studied. Too much uniformity of opinions would make a group suspicious. For the rest, all groups of ideas would be allowed to act as they please, provided they do not violate the law and do not coerce their members by any discipline. As for groups of interests, their surveillance should first imply a distinction. It is that the word interest sometimes expresses need and sometimes something else. If it is a poor worker, interest means food, housing, heating. For an employer, it means something else. When the word is taken in the first sense, the action of the public authorities should consist mainly of stimulating, supporting, and protecting the defense of interests. Otherwise, the activity of interest groups must be continuously controlled, limited, and whenever necessary repressed by the public authorities. It goes without saying that the narrowest limits and the most painful punishments are suitable for those which are naturally the most powerful. What has been called freedom of association has in fact been freedom of associations. But associations do not have to be free. They are instruments, they must be enslaved. Freedom is only suitable for the human being. As for freedom of thought, it is true to a large extent when it is said that without it there is no thought. But it is even more true to say that when thought does not exist, it is not free either. There had been a lot of freedom of thought in recent years, but there was no thought. It is roughly the situation of the child who, not having meat, asks for salt to salt it.